Let me start my talk by introducing you to Mr. Cavey. Mr. Cavey's a puppet. Right, cave puppet. Look, he's got a spear. I can wave the spear. And he's got really soft hair. And you can't tell that because you're not here, but he has. Anyway, I'm going to talk about the mind-body connection. Because what I find is that people really underestimate the mind-body connection. We talk about it and we say the mind-body connection. But actually, what is the mind-body connection? Well, I talk a lot about the fact that the subconscious is in charge 90% of the time. So in that 90% of the time, your subconscious is looking at the stuff that's around you and keeping you safe. But in that 90% of the time, it's also managing internally. So your subconscious is responsible for keeping you alive. Fundamental thing. Your heart beats without you having to beat. Evening, Jenny. You breathe without having to think about breathing. And if a virus attacks you, your subconscious will activate a viral defense and fight it off. So, for example, when you get a cold, the snot that you get from a cold is not the virus, it's you fighting the virus, which you do automatically. So your subconscious is incredibly clever. And when you have something that is threatening you, your subconscious, as well as emotionally protecting you, will also physically protect you. And there are 3 stages of threats that your subconscious activates. So the first stage of threat, when your subconscious thinks something's going to hurt you, is an emotional response, a fear response of some way, shape or form. So you get an emotional response and your brain is disengaged. That's the first level. Now, we're stubborn beings, so most of us ignore that first level. And we go, no, it doesn't matter that I'm scared, just going to get on and do it anyway, and off we go. So the second level that your subconscious then activates to keep you safe is a physical response. This is where your heart rate increases, you have a shortness of breath because your breathing gets erratic, sweaty palms, shaky. This is your body gets flooded with adrenaline. Adrenaline allows you to have the best chance of surviving an encounter with something that's going to kill you. So it's a physical response to keep you safe from something that's going to kill you. And your subconscious activates that response in looking around you and seeing what's going to hurt you. It's controlling your body, so the best way for it to keep you safe is to control your body in some way. Get you ready to fight, to run away, or to just freeze and stay still for as long as you possibly can. Again, what tends to happen is a lot of us tend to ignore this. So we might get this physical anxiety, panic, whatever you want to call it, response. In the main, we'll avoid those situations, but very often in life you can't avoid those situations. And the interesting thing, excuse the cough, is the third level that happens with some people in some situations is where your subconscious turns into a petulant little brat, and your petulant little brat stamps its foot and goes, you keep on putting yourself in danger, will you stop putting yourself in danger? And so what it does is it activates the last line of defense that it has. That last line of defense is to make it physically impossible for you to put yourself in situations that might cause you to get hurt. You've ignored the emotional fear response, you've ignored the physical fight, flight and freeze response, so now what it's going to do is, if it has to, it'll stop you getting out of bed. And this level, this third level, is where things like chronic fatigue, irritable bowel, fibromyalgia, what are called chronic illnesses, the Spoon's diseases, or whatever you want to call them. These are the ones where your subconscious gets so frustrated at you putting yourself in the line of fire that because it's in charge of your body, because it controls your breathing, your heart rate and everything else that goes on, it makes it impossible for you to ignore it. And so you find yourself in a situation where you don't have enough energy and you just literally cannot do the things that you want to do. So the subconscious is incredibly powerful. And it's not your fault. It's not that you're creating this problem. It's just that at some level, it thinks there's a problem going on. And it will do whatever's necessary to protect you. It will always do whatever's necessary to protect you. But the crazy thing is, it's wrong. The crazy thing is that these things that it thinks it's protecting you for aren't actually going to kill you. In fact, the very thing it thinks it's protecting you from, it's creating. Something like chronic fatigue, it's trying to protect yourself from putting yourself in harm, but all that's doing is making you feel really miserable and really unhappy and really frustrated and really out of things, which is causing a problem. And your subconscious actually wants you to be happy and okay. It's just trying its best, and it gets it wrong a lot of the time. The challenge is what to do about it, because trying to think your way out of problems is actually impossible in the main, because what happens when there's a problem is your brain is switched off, and your brain is where you think, and you can't think because your brain's switched off. So your subconscious takes over. So in many ways, it's about working out how to persuade your subconscious that you're not safe, or at least working out what's the risk here. What is the risk of getting hurt? What is the thing that's going to hurt me in this environment? If you break a muscle, if you break a bone, let's say you break a bone in your arm, you might say that you go to the hospital to get your bone fixed, but you don't really. What a hospital does is it puts a cast on your hand, and the cast keeps your arm straight while your brain fixes your bone. Just think about that for a second. You heal bones. When you have a cut and you go to hospital, they don't fix the cut. They stitch it together so that when your brain heals the cut, it's got the best chance of binding the flesh, the skin, whatever together. Because otherwise it will heal openly. So your subconscious, when we say your brain, we mean your subconscious, heals, fixes, defends, and keeps you alive. You can engage with that if you want to. So you can breathe, for example. Now you breathe anyway, otherwise you wouldn't be here listening to this. You breathe. And you can decide to take control of your breathing. You can go, but you can't hold your breath until you die, because your subconscious won't let you. So how do you take a deep breath? How do you hold your breath? How do you slow down your breathing? Because you don't know how to activate every individual muscle that allows you. Just think about the act of taking a deep breath. You don't have to think, expand lungs, send a signal down from the brain to the nerves, to the diaphragm, to the muscle, to pull the lungs apart. You don't have to think all of that stuff. None of that stuff. You just have to think, take a deep breath. Some visualization of a balloon expanding, or what is it? Not a harmonica, because that's a harpsichord. Is that it? No, that's not a harpsichord. That's a, what is it? Accordion. Accordion. Thanks for helping me, everybody. Jeez. So the accordion, where you kind of go like this, you know. It doesn't matter how you visualize it. What matters is when you think of taking a deep breath, you do not think of it in a biological, scientific way. You think of it in a visualization way. Visualizations are the language of the brain. If you need to engage with your subconscious, if you want to speak subconscious, then the way you speak subconscious is through visualization. Visualization of objects, shapes, movements, sounds. Anything like that is the way that you engage with your body. So, for example, if you broke a bone in your arm, and you know already that your brain's going to fix it, you could visualize it healing quicker. It's possible, right? If you can accept that your brain already heals it, then it's not such a stretch to say you could heal it quicker, right? So all you have to do is work out the visualization that is heal my bone. So the visualization might be a little bunch of guys filling in plaster, or squirting that foam in that expands and hardens, you know. It might be something else, because everybody's different. You see, that's the beautiful thing, is we're all different, we all think differently. So you could visualize it any way you want to. So if you have a physical thing going on, then what you know is your subconscious is controlling it. And your subconscious is controlling it with the best intent. It's meaning to keep you safe and well. And it's controlling it. And if you can find a way of communicating with it, then you can interrupt that process. You can accelerate healing, you can slow down something, you can change something. You can even do it with pain. Because when you hurt yourself, if I do this, which would be a really stupid thing to do, but let's say I did the really stupid thing. If I do this, what happens is a signal goes up my arm, through the nerves, through the spine, into my head. And it says, what should I do, boss? There's this thing going on, and I don't know what to do. And your head goes, you know what? You're being a muppet and you're tapping your hand. So just stop that and the pain will go away. But if, for example, something was stood on my hand, then what would happen is when that signal goes to my brain goes, oh my God, something stood on your hand. We meant to make this really, really, really hurt. So you notice that something stood on your hand and you get it off. Or let's say I'm running away from something that's about to kill me and I stand on a sharp rock. If I stop to go, ow, ooh, that hurt, then I'm going to die. So what happens is the signal goes to the brain going, oh, we've stood on a sharp rock, what should we do? And the brain goes, hang on a second, you need to survive, and so we need to turn the volume down on the pain. So there's a volume control in your head. As a volume control in your head, pain is subjective. This is why some people have what's called low pain threshold, high pain thresholds. This is why people do amazing feats when adrenaline's flooding through their body, lift cars and things like that, because they're not aware. After an accident, very often people don't feel the worst of the pain. It's later that you feel the pain. And if you think about a time where you had really bad pain, which most of us will have had at some point, can you remember how bad the pain was? You probably can't. You can remember experiencing traumatic aspect of pain, possibly, but you can't remember actually how bad the pain was because we don't remember that kind of thing. So pain is controlled by a dial in our subconscious as well. So everything is controlled in this control room in our brain. And if we know that, then we just have to work out how to connect. So hay fever, take hay fever for example. Hay fever, hello, hay fever is a miscalculation in the brain where it interprets that grain of pollen. I'm doing this because it really isn't that big, obviously. It interprets that tiny grain of pollen as a virus. And because it thinks a virus has just attacked your system, it launches a viral defense. We've already established that your brain will defend you against viruses. It launches a viral defense. The streaming eyes is trying to clear it out. Streaming nose, trying to clear it out. All the swelling is part of the friction caused by your subconscious defending you against the grain of pollen. So if you could persuade your brain that a grain of pollen was actually harmless, that it wasn't something you needed defending against, that it was something like, for example, a grain of dust, and dust is fine, then you wouldn't have a hay fever reaction because your brain wouldn't launch a defense and the pollen would come and go harmlessly as a grain of dust would come and go harmlessly. Or if it was dust, or if it was animal fur, or if it was anything. For me, I've got an allergy to feathers. Grew up on a chicken farm, that's what I blame. Okay, but, you know, I've got an allergy to feathers, which brings me out in a cold because obviously the dust from feathers in some way makes my brain think I'm being attacked. So if you have a cold, you can accelerate your way through by maximising your antibodies, attacking the cold. And you just have to visualise it. If you visualise something, it will happen. So the key to remember is, when we say mind-body connection, it's a two-way thing. The body informs the mind informs the body. I often think of it like a car and a driver. So you can have the coolest, most wonderful car with all the greatest gizmos and gadgets, but if nobody's driving it, it's as good as a lump of metal. You can have somebody who's a really skilled driver, but if they don't have anything to drive, then that skill is kind of useless. Now, if you put a driver and a car together, and the driver doesn't know how to use the car properly, then it's not going to get the best out of it. And if a car has all these great things, but the driver doesn't know how to use them, that's not going to work best either. So, for me, the mind-body thing is like a car and driver thing. And if we want to get a little bit more scientific here, So those of you who don't want to get more scientific might just go make a cup of tea or something. Let's get a bit more scientific here. There is a book, a brilliant book. There are a couple of books on this one, but there's a really good book by a guy called Bruce Lipton called The Biology of Belief. I say it's a brilliant book. It's a bit boring for the first 63 pages. and he's a scientist. And the first 63 pages are quite boring science stuff. But on page 63, I think it was, might be page 67, but somewhere around there, he gets to the point. And the point is, we all believe that a cell is controlled by the nucleus, that a nucleus is the brain of a cell. And the nucleus tells the cell what to do. But the cell has a membrane. So if you take the nucleus out of a cell will survive for about 2 weeks. If you put the cell in a bad environment so that the membrane is affected, the cell will die immediately. Think about that. If you destroy the membrane of the cell dies immediately. If you destroy the nucleus, the cell can last for some amount of time. So the membrane of the cell is actually the brain of the cell. It takes what your subconscious tells it and it passes it down to the nucleus. Now, in the nucleus are a bunch of switches. There's the DNA programming, but there's also a bunch of switches. They're called RNA switches, which we're learning a lot more about these days. And the switch can switch the cell on and off. There is a plant in America that has an RNA switch in it that when a certain insect lands on the plant, an insect that is damaging for the plant, this switch gets triggered and the plant releases a toxin that's only toxic to that bug, and the bug gets killed. But only releases it if that bug lands on that plant. Just this little RNA switch. So it's not DNA, but it's a little switch like DNA that is activated. And the thing that tells it to activate comes from the cell membrane. So your mind and body, what happens is your mind is informing the membrane, which communicates with the centre of the cell in the nucleus and tells it what to do. Now, if we take a step back for a moment, they did an experiment on mice, which they often do experiments on, and they made a mouse phobic to the smell of cherry blossom by zapping it every time it smelled cherry blossom. Not pleasant, not fun, not any of that stuff. But the thing that was really interesting is when that mouse then had baby mice, the baby mice were phobic to the smell of cherry blossom. Having never experienced the zapping, the mouse wasn't pregnant at the time, having never experienced the zapping, when they smelt cherry blossom, they were phobic to it. When a cow is born, technically called a calf, I believe, when a calf is born, it knows that a cattle grid is something it shouldn't walk on. If you paint lines on a road, a calf will not walk on them. Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think cattle grids were around in the caveman days. So they're not part of our genetic coding. So how did a cow learn that cattle grids can't be walked on? How did a baby cow that's never been near a cattle grid know that you can't walk on a cattle grid? How does this information get passed down? Because DNA takes generations to update. So how do we pass down within one generation the phobia of the smell of cherry blossom? How do we pass down to a calf that a cattle grid's not safe? In the cell membrane. That's my theory. So my theory is we pass it down in the cells. Because when we talk about the caveman rules of survival, we talk about 3 primitive rules that are all based on what was necessary to survive in the caveman days. And while we seem to have adapted those rules to deal with the modern day, so emotional hurt is equal to physical hurt, etc., we haven't actually evolved those rules to go, you know what, something that hurts us isn't going to kill us anymore. Don't worry about it. So the rules still stay. We've adapted. So how do we pass down these rules? We've evolved to walk on 2 legs and all that sort of stuff. How do we pass down these caveman rules? In the cell membrane. That's just a thought, right? In a cell membrane. So in the cell membrane, when you have a baby, these genetic learnings that we pass down generation by generation come in the cell membrane. And then activate these switches, these on and off switches, which we know we have. So if we were to take that one next step, if you're still with me, if if we would take that one next step, if we were to cure somebody who had diabetes so that we changed the switches in their cells so that when they had a baby, it wasn't passed down, would that cure it? I don't know. All I know is that we are following a really set of primitive rules in our day-to-day life as we grow up that are affecting all of us in our day-to-day life. These rules based on fight, flight and freeze, which comes from a belief that something is going to kill us. And it isn't. There's nothing that's going to kill us, and yet we're still doing this. So how come generation after generation we're passing this information down? How come a mouse can have a baby mouse that is phobic? How come a calf is scared of a cattle grid when it's never seen one? So the mind-body... So when you read these books about gut bacteria and all this sort of stuff, when you read scientific studies about the release of oxytocin and serotonin and all these things, for me, when I read it, it's like a little bit chicken and egg. You know, was that already there, or did the brain create it in response to some sort of external stimulus? But what the really cool thing about it is it just opens up the possibility. It opens up the possibility that if you can work out how, then pretty much anything can be changed, right? If you can work out how. If you can find the language that your brain and body speak and you can communicate with them, then anything is really possible. It's just working out how to. And sometimes it takes time, you know. It's not an overnight process like none of this stuff, but it's possible. So, those are my thoughts on the mind-body connection. So the other guy that's always worth a read, and I've mentioned him before, is Dr. David Hamilton. His first book is called How Your Mind Can Heal Your Body. And I believe it's his best book. He has a bunch of other books and he does workshops. He's based in Stirling, actually. I think I've shared it on the page a couple of times, his workshops coming up. So you've got Bruce Lipton's The Biology of Belief. You've got David Hamilton, or Dr. David Hamilton, How Your Mind Can Heal Your Body. And then the other one that's really interesting, the other one is Candice Pert. Oh man, what's her book called? The Molecules of Emotion. That one's really interesting. Candice Pert is a female scientist who has a real bee in a bonnet about not being given enough credibility because she was female. And I'm not saying that that's not true at all. I believe that her colleagues got a Nobel Prize for some work that she was involved in and she didn't get credited on it. So she has reason to gripe. But if you read The Molecules of Emotion all the way through the book, you're like, yeah, okay. You know, I get it. I get that you've got a problem. But in the book, she talks about, she was involved in the early drug studies to cure addictions. And there's fascinating stuff about the way brain and bodies grow receptors and how addictions scientifically work. And it is a very technical book, in between her griping. But it's a good book to read. So it depends what level you like reading. David Hamilton books, he tends to start, the first half of the book is a bunch of case studies. Example, where you're like, yeah, get to the point. Second half of the book, he does get to the point. So I find his books are the lightest. Biology of Belief, probably the next down. And Molecules of Emotion is probably the most technical of the books that I would recommend to read. It just really depends on what you like. But it's interesting to watch it. So it's interesting to watch. People often ask me, do we learn phobias? Do we learn our parents' behaviour? And I don't believe we do learn our parents' behaviour. I believe we learn, our subconscious learns from observing our parents what it feels it needs to learn, but you have no control over that. So if your mother's scared of lightning, it doesn't mean genetically you're automatically scared of lightning. But it may be that your subconscious, through watching your mother, goes, lightning is something I should learn to be scared of. I'm not quite sure why, but my mother is, and I must learn from my mother, so I'm going to be scared of lightning. But equally, you could go, I love lightning, and I'm not going to be scared of it, because my mother is scared of it, and I don't want to be like her. So there's a whole kind of rabbit warren we can go down here around these things, what they really do, how they're passed. But what I do know is, our brains are working on a very primitive set of rules, and this is probably a good time to bring Cavey into it. You didn't see Cavey, did you? Because you weren't here at the start. This is Cavey, look. You can wave his spear. He's got a really soft head. He's so cute. Hello. So, Cavey will be coming to my talks. Hello. He won't talk, he'll just wave his spear. So, we're working on this really primitive set of ideas. This caveman, fight, flight, freeze is primitive. It's based on something's going to kill you, and nothing kills us these days in that way. There are no predators. So somehow, despite it being thousands of years since we had predators, we're still responding in the same way in our subconscious. So how is that passed down when it's no longer applicable, when we've evolved out of walking on all fours and all that sort of stuff? So I just think it's a really interesting concept, and it's the study of it is called epigenetics, and it's the single most prevalent field at the moment in psychology and neuroscience, the study of epigenetics. You'll see studies, obesity is linked to childhood trauma, the effects of starvation, all these things. You'll see lots and lots of studies that try and explain how we behave today based on epigenetics. Yeah, I think fight, flight, freeze is in the cell membrane. I think it's past that knowledge, like the cattle grid, is in the cell membrane. Because if it was in the DNA, we'd have evolved out of it. That's my theory, if it was in our blueprint. So for me, the DNA is like the blueprint for a car. It's pretty fixed. So if it was in the DNA, then we'd have evolved out of it, and we haven't. We've still got fight, flight, freeze. So the only way I can think it's being passed down is in the cell membrane. In each new baby born, the cell membrane has it in it. That's my theory, but nobody knows, because everybody still, as I say, this study of epigenetics, I'm sitting here cuddling Cavey, this study of epigenetics, don't study me, you can't talk, it's okay, is what's, and I find it fascinating because I'm a kind of sciencey person. What I find fascinating is, again and again, we know these links with the clients. We know these links to the caveman rules of how we work. I see it again and again in everybody we do. Subconscious, the whole principle of the way the subconscious works, this switching off of our cognitive brain. That 10% is the thing that defines us as different from animals. That 10% is the thing that allows us to not eat, to actually store food in the house and not eat everything. That's what animals can't do that. So the 10% is what allows us to overcome our cognitive bias and all this sort of stuff. And it allows us to overcome some of the subconscious stuff. But it is only 10%. Most of the time we're at the whim of our subconscious. So I think that the cell membrane is the way it's passed down. And then if you think about that visualization, the language of the brain, if you talk to the brain and the brain then communicates to the cell membrane will activate the cell in the way that you've started with your communication through a visualization. But you start with a visualization first, then through your subconscious, then that activates it through your body. You just have to work out how, and you have to do it on a repetitive basis. It's not just enough to think about it once. If we find a way for the parent to change something, so let's just take diabetes for example, because we know that is passed down genetically, right? So, but it's not passed down automatically genetically. Not every child is automatically diabetic of a diabetic parent. Often it skips a generation, interestingly. So let's just take diabetes for a moment. So let's say we find a way through visualization and talking to the subconscious to cure diabetes, right? So diabetes is caused because the pancreas is not producing enough insulin. And so what we do is we substitute the insulin through injections or through tablets. So let's say through visualization we can work out a way of getting the pancreas to function normally with insulin. Theoretically, if the pancreas now knows how to function normally with insulin, that information will be passed down in the cell membrane of a normal functioning pancreas. It's possible that there's an RNA switch that says that messes up the way the pancreas functions. So that switch can be activated or deactivated based on things. So my husband, his dad was diabetic. My husband was fine until he had a really bad accident and ended up paralysed, and the accident triggered off his diabetes. intense stress can often trigger off diabetes. So it was a switch with him that was dormant, but then something happened. But it's possible, right? So if something can be in a state of okay and then in a state of not okay, then something changes it. And if you can work out what changes it, then through deliberate visualization and action, you can activate that change. That's the tricky thing, working that out. So we talk about dopamine. I talk about dopamine with my clients a lot. Dopamine is a drug that is produced every time you do something familiar. So it's automatically produced. Now, dopamine also happens to be a lack of dopamine happens to be the basis of problems with Parkinson's as a disease. And so what we do is we give people dopamine tablets. But a tablet is not measured. Your brain measures how much dopamine it releases based on circumstance, and it delivers it to the right part of your body. A tablet doesn't. It's a fixed dose that goes everywhere. It's the same problem with antibiotics. Antibiotics are a tablet or an injection that goes everywhere that is broad scale. Whereas if your body fights off a virus, releases antivirals in some way, then it does it automatically and it targets that thing, and then it learns what it's done from doing that thing, and so it automatically knows how to do it next time. And because antibiotics are broad sweep, that's why we're getting to a crisis where we're going to run out of things to fight the viruses, because the antibiotics have just kind of covered all of them, and then they mutate and they find a way around it. So yeah, you can see why I kind of go, ooh, with this stuff, because it's the potential is huge. I firmly believe anything is possible. You can address anything physically and anything mentally, and even better if you address it both ways. So if you take paracetamol and Panadol, they are exactly the same medicine, except paracetamol costs 17p, Panadol costs £1.17. They're in different boxes. If you ask anybody, they'll tell you Panadol is better than paracetamol, but they're actually the same tablet. Because the tablet is designed to perform at this level. In a test tube, it would perform at this level. But you put it in the body, and there's other things that affect it, including the mind, right? So you affect it with the mind, and it can perform at this level, or it can perform at this level. So it's designed in a test tube to perform here, but you, with your mind, you can alter it like that. So if you really want to go to the next level, if you really want to get crazy on this, then let's talk about head transplants. Told you it was crazy, right? They have, I have no idea how, they have proved you can now do a head transplant. And it is going through the process of the ethics of what's possible with this. And I think I'd asked a question in the cave at some point. If you put your head on somebody else's body, will that body then mirror what the head thinks, right? Because given what we've just talked about, that the subconscious is in charge. So let's say take diabetes again. Let's say you have a problem with your pancreas. You put your head on somebody else's body. My theory is their body will also then develop a problem with the pancreas, because the mind is controlling what happens with the body. The mind communicates with the membrane tells the cell what to do, the cell activates it. That's my theory. So I don't think that putting somebody's head on a different body would actually solve anything physically. Even potentially full paralysis or something like that. I don't know. And I wouldn't want to try it because I don't think it's a particularly good idea. I think it's a crazy idea to do head transplants. And I hope they never do. And I have no idea how they've worked out that they can. But this thing of the subconscious controls is the communicating control center for the cells. And the cell's active based on what happens in the brain. And something happening in the cell will communicate back to the brain. You know, something's attacking the cell, will go back to the subconscious going, whoa, something's attacking me, tell me what to do. And the brain directs and controls. So it's a two-way process, always a two-way process. And anything's possible. Are you still with me? You probably would have left if you weren't. But you can tell this stuff's really interesting, right? And I don't think anybody has the answers. That's what epigenetics is studying. Nobody has the answers. And you get contra theories out pretty much every week. One will say this categorically, somebody will say that. Addictions are always a really interesting one for people to talk about. And as I say, a lot of the time it's chicken and egg. You know, people with addictions have a higher volume of this in their body. Yeah, but do they have a higher volume of this in their body because their brain's producing more of that because of the addiction, or is that causing the addiction in the first place? You know, there's lots of really cool stuff with this, and it's just, for me, it comes down to Bruce Lipton's stuff as the idea of biology of belief. A lot of it comes down to belief, what you can do with your head, and then just trying it and seeing where it goes to. And I've seen amazing things with clients as a result of doing this, where we work together as a team and we change things physically. It's quite powerful. There are these things called mirror neurons, and a mirror neuron is what makes you smile. So if I smile, you can't help but smile, and that's a mirror neuron. And so we mirror other people's moods. So if somebody's in a really bad mood, it brings you down, and if somebody's really up, it brings you up, right? So we do take on other people's, call it energies, call it stuff like that. It's worth knowing. In fact, mirror neurons, if somebody's had a stroke and lost a part of their brain so that they can't perform a function, you can regrow that part of the brain or regrow that function in another part of the brain by repeated visualizations, by repeated actions, or by repeatedly watching somebody else do the thing. Isn't that cool? So if I needed to learn to lift up the sellotape, as you randomly have a roll of sellotape next to you. So if I needed to learn to lift up this sellotape, and I'd lost the ability to move my right arm, just checking that it's my right arm. If I lost the ability to do that, then I could, in my head, imagine doing this, and I could relearn. I could do this for a while every day, and I could relearn it. Or I could watch you do this, and my brain would equally relearn it. That's neuroplasticity again. Neuroplasticity is amazing. So we can, but there is a way to realise that you don't know what other people are thinking, and to stop them having power over you where you feel. But that can take a bit of doing. It can take a bit of unlocking of alert points and things like that. I don't think there's a technique that I can describe to you other than be aware that everybody has their own reality and nobody can read minds. So anything that you think's going on is actually not what's going on in their mind, it's just what's going on in yours. And you can imagine yourself in a bubble, or in a blanket or a cloak or something like that. Your brain can regrow totally a part of the brain that's damaged. It can ignore, let's say it's damaged here, it can ignore it and regrow that function somewhere else. And you can do it. And if you think about those who have who've had a stroke, their ability to recover is phenomenal. The difference in a week, you know, I would go into the hospital and see somebody after the first day after the stroke and see them a week later. And it's amazing, and the brain, that part of the brain was damaged, and the other part relearns. So our brain is quite amazing, and is technically plastic. It technically moves around. It's a muscle, and you can do stuff to train it and stuff. Again, it's mind blowing what is possible, and just so many people limit what's possible by their belief in what's possible. If you just allow yourself to believe anything's possible, and it's just simply a puzzle to work out how, then you can do anything. Just takes time. Nothing's instant. Everything takes time. That's the thing to remember.